such as the RPS. And in that energy plan, it's mentioned at great length that wind can help the state of Virginia to increase its indigenous energy production, which is a goal of that plan. I would point out a fact that I think is important as we consider this matter going forward. Virginia is the second leading importer of energy generation in the entire United States. And you will find that utilities, particularly I hear Dominion talk about that with great consistency in Richmond. So while you can stand out here in front of the building and see a whole lot of coal going toward the ocean, going toward Norfolk, going toward Hampton to be shipped out, we're the second leading importer of energy sources in the country. So one would assume with an RPS, and Bruce, I think it was quite pointedly talked about some differences between a voluntary and a mandatory RPS. Yes, we do have a requirement that is supposed to be met by the utilities by 2025, but I think a very timely question is to what extent is that requirement really functioning as an economic driver? And I think we'll investigate that a little further in another slide and probably at the end of the discussion. And then finally, as Carol has talked about, we do have the permit by rule that's administered and enforced by DEQ. I've heard another developer recently say that part of the reason that they've decided to come and really look for sites and work in Virginia is because of the existence of this permit by rule after having evaluated the 6 to 7 years it took the Highland project to try to get a permit from the SCC. So I think we've seen that the PBR is being seen by developers as being an encouraging element, not a slam dunk by any means, but something that really does help encourage certainty that's helping to bring developers to the state. So I occasionally come up with the kind of cute, I guess, or trying to be cute titles for my slides, and so here's one, but I think it gets to the point. Back to the RPS, the carrot or the stick, okay? And I think that's really what it's about, what it was about when it was debated in Richmond several years ago by the legislature. Numerous states at the time, I think it was 23 or 4 states at the time, 2007, across the country had mandatory RPSs. And Virginia, it was first presented as a mandatory RPS. At the end of the day, it didn't come out as, when you're making sausage, you never know, what's going in and what's coming out. And that's what happened with the RPS. It went in as a mandatory RPS. It came out as a voluntary RPS. And the theory was, of course, that in a voluntary RPS, that it would be incentive-based. And that's an important matter to point out. It wasn't just a matter of, if we feel like doing it, we might do it. I mean, it was incentive-based, and in theory, that was going to drive development in a similar way that a mandatory-based RPS would. Keep in mind, typically where there is a mandatory RPS, there are penalties associated with not achieving your goals. And in a number of states, and I know we can speak to this a lot better than I can, there are a variety of different programs that are set up or facilitated through the use of those penalty fees that typically help to promote wind and renewable. So we don't have that here. Another couple things, you can get it into the technical elements of it, but I think it's worth just understanding the RPS. In Virginia, you set up a baseline at the beginning of the program, and then you say you have to hit goals, and it extends, as you saw, all the way to 25 and 15%. But there are incremental goals that utilities are supposed to reach along the way. As the baseline gets set in Virginia, from the very beginning to set the baseline, when you're thinking of, 15%, we got to do 15% of our energy from renewables by 2025. Well, when the baseline was set, the RPS was arranged such that nuclear is subtracted from the baseline. We've got quite a bit of nuclear production in Virginia, and it serves to sort of reward nuclear in a certain way, and also, if you will, it lowers the denominator when you look at the fraction as to how much renewables we're actually going to need to achieve here in Virginia. I would also point out that the Virginia RPS, and there are a lot of different specifics for RPSs in these states. In our RPS, we allow out-of-state RECs, or renewable energy credits, that count towards meeting the goal. Some states don't allow that. As Bruce pointed out, some states have a carve-out for solar. There's a lot of different mechanisms within an RPS that can help to define its effectiveness. But in Virginia, you can use out-of-state RECs to meet your goals. I guess I'm kind of not stating it directly, but in that particular case, the net effect of it can be that if the out-of-state RECs are so cheap, it may not be in the interest of the state to actually develop in your state and achieve the associated economic and job benefits. Instead, you can perhaps seize upon the opportunity for less expensive RECs coming from other places, and then build your portfolio that way. Using Minnesota as an example, things have occurred considerably differently in Minnesota. They have a much longer history of having a mandate. The takeaway that I guess I would mention from this particular slide is that when they set the program up in Minnesota, their largest utility was actually seeking to have permission to store more spent nuclear fuel in state. And the State Corporation Commission, in order for them to do that, said, okay, but you have to commit to building wind power. And that's kind of how things started. And you fast forward to today, they've got 2,200 megawatts in Minnesota. Again, it's a mandated RPS. The utilities are ahead of the goals, and it's interesting that Tim Pawlenty, I think, had championed that from the very beginning. In Virginia, we see that there are a number of developers that are competing to secure sites. I think that's a good thing. The number that I show you here is, I think, a little different from the one that Bruce showed. It can be tough to know exactly what the queue contains, but I think bottom line, this number, in my estimation, if I updated it properly, reflects not the offshore queue position in Virginia, but only onshore. And I think that may show us a little larger than what Bruce did. I think it's really good news as well. The developers are working cooperatively on regulatory and legislative issues in Virginia. But when we look at the big goose egg for Virginia in terms of megawatts, and I think we've considered already, and maybe we will a little more, why are we there? Why do we have 0 megawatts? I'm going to point to this. Everyone's familiar with NIMBY and what that phrase implies. I think the reality is in Virginia we go a little bit beyond NIMBY, and just for fun, I'm going to call it NIMBY-OY, and what I'm using that to reference is not in my backyard or over yonder either. That's kind of a silly way to say that there have been people in Virginia that have been engaged against wind power from 1 or 2 selected counties for quite a while, and they are organized and they export their knowledge to another county when they find out there's a project going on. So it's a very real challenge in Virginia, probably everywhere, but it's something that you have to take seriously as to how you're going to overcome that. Typically developers don't invest significant resources until their site is secure. And we work incrementally. Not only do you hopefully have your lease in place and your site secure, but you're also going to consider further investments based upon whether your interconnection has been approved by PJM, what the cost of the interconnection is, whether you have received a hazard determination from the Federal Aviation Administration, and so forth. So structurally, In some places, and I think some counties in Virginia, it's the case, the developers tend to work incrementally. They look for site control before they invest, but at the same time, you have some organized opposition that they tend to get out in front of the issue. So sometimes the developer is effectively, at the local level, left to do a job of catch-up.